sometimes now I can still hear her laugh. She had this laugh that, you know, even when I look at her picture over there, I could hear her laughing, you know. Her laugh, and she would do silly things, put lizards on her ears, you know. I see these things, you know, when I think about her. And I have a kid that does the same thing, and I'm like, it makes me think of her, you know.
On November 5th, 2005, Lake Charles police pulled the body of Brandy Dyson, a 32-year-old Kinder woman, from the lake behind the Civic Center. The investigation that ensued led family members on a journey to find closure and justice that still continues today. Exactly 1 month after Dyson's body was found, Lake Charles detectives arrested a man in Tacoma, Washington who they thought was responsible for Dyson's death. Jeremiah Salazar was then extradited to Calcasieu Parish, where a Calcasieu Parish grand jury indicted him on 1 count of second-degree murder. When new evidence surfaced that excluded Salazar as a suspect, Dyson's family was left with more questions than answers, and Lake Charles detectives were left with a case that has since gone cold.
My family is all from Cameron. Hurricane Rita hits, we all lose our home. My sister at the time was living in Kinder in her own place, and she took in some evacuees from New Orleans. And because she did that, she was kicked out of her apartment. So then she started staying in the shelter of the Civic Center. While she was there, she gets drunk, she gets kicked out. So she's living off of one of the piers. And that part of it we really don't know a lot about. We just know they believe she was living off one of the piers with the guy who they think, you know, did what they did to her. I was living in Alabama. My mom was in Arkansas. My dad was here in Westlake. We were all displaced all over, you know, and then we get a call. My brother's at the Civic Center. He's having to identify her body. And because of her being arrested, they were able to find out who she was by fingerprints.
What do you think about the investigation as a whole? How long did the investigation last? Which agency investigated it?
The Lake Charles Police Department did. I had weekly contact with them and from November when it happened until July the 12th of 2007 when they let him go. You know, I would call and say, okay, what's going on? Well, you know, we're just waiting. We have the grand jury indictment. And then they call and say, we don't know why, but the DA is going back in front of the grand jury. You know.
Did you have any contact with anybody from the DA's office?
We did a couple of times, but they really didn't. I mean, they couldn't, I guess, tell us what was going on, being that the way things were going. So, I mean, we really didn't know. We just knew, okay, they're going back in front of the grand jury.
Did you feel confident after the first indictment that they had the person and that this was going to be over?
Yes.
And what about when the grand jury failed to re-indict him the second time? How did you find out about that? What was that like?
Actually, the DA who was handling the case called me and told me that the grand jury decided that it would be no true bill for the second indictment. I always thought once you got an indictment, you didn't go back in front. But for some reason, he felt that he had to.
Do you think as far as the police go, they're trying to keep things a little, I guess, close to the vest because they don't want to let a lot of details out in case they do find.
They're trying to protect the case. Yeah. Yes, and I'm thankful for that because the only person that would know what happened would be the person who did it. You know, it was a homicide. It wasn't just, you know, It wasn't like, okay, he got a gun and he shot her. It wasn't anything like that. It was a violent death. It wasn't just, you know, okay, I can shoot you and you die. You know, it wasn't anything like that. It was very violent. We do know that much. It was very violent.
You said that you feel like you don't really know what the next step is now. Talk to me a little bit about that.
There's no, I know of no one that tells you, okay, this is the steps that you have to do to get your case going again. You know, there's people that's out there for the accused, but these victims and their families have nobody really, you know, okay, this is what you do, this is how you get it going, this is how you find information out, you know. So it's like, okay, what do you do next? You know, do you sit and you wait for somebody to call you? Or do you keep calling them? Or do you get the media involved? You know, what do you do?
Well, he was initially indicted, and as the case flowed on, DNA testing was done, because we did in fact have DNA samples from the victim's body, and it was determined that the DNA excluded Salazar as a potential defendant. So it was brought back to the grand jury. That new evidence was presented along with the rest of the evidence, and the grand jury returned a no true bill. And that was the end of the case for that time. Understand that one of the reasons that we sometimes do that is so that we don't leave the case open with no progress. If we do that, our prescriptive period runs and can toll, which means that the case is then over and cannot be refiled. Once it is dismissed, as we did in this case, if we obtain additional evidence, new evidence, that we can utilize to prosecute this defendant or any other defendant, then we can re-indict. We can re-indict the same defendant simply with the additional evidence. And the prescription does not run in that case. So that's why we do this kind of thing.
So just because he was, the grand jury did return a no true bill, that doesn't mean the case is over.
It does not. It means that at that time the grand jury felt like there was not sufficient probable cause to go forward. And remember that even though the grand jury only needs probable cause, which I will categorize as in a terms of 0 to 100%, maybe a 30 or 35% requirement, that we have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have to actually go a lot farther than that to prove to a jury that this defendant, this particular defendant, is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why there's such a big discrepancy. So the case is now not pending, but at the same time, law enforcement is ever vigilant that if something comes up in this case, or if they can turn over some new evidence that will re-enliven this case, then we will take another look at it and bring it back to the grand jury and re-indict or indict the proper individual.
Now, we did speak to Brandy Dyson's sister, and one of her main concerns was she felt like she didn't know where to go from this point. The case, she characterized it as a cold case. She said she really didn't know what her next steps were. I mean, is there something that the families at this point should be doing, or is it's just totally in the hands of law enforcement?
I think law enforcement is going to have to take the next step, and I know that they continue to look into these things, particularly this case, because I've talked to them about it in the past. But any further activity is going to have to be generated by law enforcement. Frustrating though it may be, and I can certainly understand that for any family that's had this kind of event take place, there is nothing for them to do at this point relative to the prosecution of this case. We have to just get more evidence, or get some significant evidence that'll enable us to go back to the grand jury with it.